looks like it wasn't as damaged as the roadside. There was some workers looking that earlier today picture that they were kind of on the rail side to maintain that rail line is very important for Russia in their offensive and their in the war in Ukraine. Russia heavily relies on the Kerch rail line to maintain supplies on their forces across southern Ukraine. So right now, just now, it looks like there might be some civilian traffic, but very minimum compared to what's probably normal in that aspect. I think the consensus is that the Ukrainians used maritime drones to conduct this attack. I know Oliver can probably go more into detail on that, on the kind of maybe what are the platform, but I think that's the
And
consensus that was used.
and
Go ahead, Margaret.
another thing as well I want to mention. Now I want you to expand on it. Is Sweden getting the green light by Turkey to join NATO, which I think was expected, as we saw with Finland. But it is major nonetheless. Now the border with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the border that NATO shares with Russia, I think, doubled in length. So Russia is in a very tough position. You've just got, since the war, you've got an attempted mutiny, whatever you want to call it, by Prigozhin. Putin seemed weak, and he's still dealing with the repercussions of that. To this day, we still don't know what his deal is with Prigozhin. We've got the expansion of NATO's border. NATO expanded more to the east, and you got two countries that were non-aligned now joined NATO, Finland and Sweden. So the border with NATO and Ukraine, NATO and Russia doubled. And you've got obviously the invasion in Ukraine was meant to take a few weeks, and we're still facing that war with significant support by NATO. And now you've got Ukraine that is attacking Russian territory that I thought would be always a no-no, at least in the early days of the war. And now today, what we saw is not only did they attack the bridge again. I actually messed up. If anyone sees a tweet that I did, if anyone's pissed off at me because I put the wrong video, I apologize. I did a correction, but the reason I'm mentioning that mistake that I made in that tweet is that the video I included is from last year, the same bridge. But this time, Ukraine swiftly took responsibility for the attack, which is something pretty uncommon. Correct me if I'm wrong, all source. So you've got Ukraine attacking Russian territory. We saw the drone over the Kremlin, and we've seen other attacks within Russian territory, and being pretty. And as we know, Crimea is considered a red line for Putin, and being pretty open about it, and their confidence seems to be increasing despite the counteroffensive slowing.
Yeah, and to your point, actually, Mario, just today, the Ukrainian military intelligence, GRU, published a video of an ambush of a pro-Ukrainian Chechen group that went into Belgorod, actual Russian territory, internationally recognized Russian territory, and did an ambush against a Russian military truck where two Russian service members were killed. And I just highlight that because this is a very common occurrence, right? I think attacks in Russia proper is a very common occurrence. And I think it kind of undermines this notion of, Russia created the situation of trying to invade Ukraine for stability. And what they've actually seen, I think, to your point, is that now not only, Russia occupied Ukraine, but just Russia proper has seen extensive levels of disability and increased Ukrainian attacks. I think the Sweden thing is actually one thing that you didn't mention. I think that is important to highlight is that the importance of Sweden joining NATO is now the Baltic Sea, colloquially is now a NATO lake, which is that Baltic Sea is very important for St. Petersburg. And Sweden joining effectively makes that entire northern Baltic Sea a NATO, de facto lake. Go ahead, Mario.
Yeah, so I want to go to Snekotron just to balance it out, because Snekotron, on the other side, we are seeing the Ukrainian counteroffensive underwhelm, and I think even the West admits that it is underwhelming. But considering everything we're seeing and the developments we've seen month over month, like I think if all those developments happened in a year ago, all at once in 1 month, for us that would be like the end of the world. Yet because it happened gradually, I'm talking about from the attempted, great Patrick's here, from the attempted mutiny to Ukraine having all the ammunition, potential F-16, having the tanks, now cluster bombs, and the amount of support from the West, attacking Russian territory. So all these, the attack on the Kremlin or the drone over the Kremlin, which is an embarrassment to the Kremlin. So all these attacks combined, but it happened over 12 months or whatever, slowly escalating to where we are today. Are you worried? Are you worried about the path we're heading down? Or am I over exaggerating? Is my concern not warranted, Snikachan?
Well, I mean, I don't know why people are hyperventilating over this. I mean, the drone attacks over Moscow. I mean, you freaked out over it, but I told you for months before they've been doing this, and they are a small enough scale where they don't cause any real damage. And you look at what's going on with the trends in losses as well as production, and especially drone production is scaling up on the Russian side. Like it really is getting to the point. I mean, you did see the dramatic results of all the Lancet FPV drone strikes um, on the Zaporozhye front that basically blunted that offensive. And right now, they're in other sectors, Russia's beginning to creep up on their own offensive. So, and you look at the what happened on the Crimean Bridge. Well, I mean, they damaged the road section. It wasn't as bad as the last time, and you have the rail sections completely undamaged, and there's already rail traffic flowing. So I don't know why people are just
But
hyperventilating over this.
but the thing is, we do have the deal, the grain deal that's been terminated. I know they said it's unrelated, but something to worth mentioning. And on top of it, again, Ukraine took responsibility for the attack relatively quickly, and there's allegations of US providing intelligence. Now, I know this is not the first time for either, and I know US constantly provides intelligence, but putting them all together, you don't think, like, even though the attack isn't that major, Ukraine taking responsibility, and Russia's calling it a terrorist attack, just I think
No, because
the argument
this is always going to be a throwdown, because what it was is the grain deal was always, well, two things. Well, one, the grain deal was done because the Russian economy was in a much worse place last year, and basically this year, as the economy came back to growth again, the grain deal ends because it can end. And this was already kind of talked about for months beforehand, and everybody was waiting for this moment to happen. And there's going to be a sort of battle for control of the Black Sea, and you're going to probably see that in the next few months, and we'll see what whether or not the Ukraine can actually maintain a presence, or if it's just going to have the port of Odessa smashed and unable to actually continue function. I mean, this all this stuff again. Like, this a lot of the stuff had to be prepared in the background of dealing with sanctions, dealing with rerouting logistics to the east, and also solving production issues. Like all these things, it had to happen in the background, and people are focusing too much on the political events and not looking at the material trends. And the material trends this year, you're looking at increasing production of vehicles, increasing production of drones. These defense concerns have more than doubled their headcount since last year. I mean,
what do you think of the Ukrainian counteroffensive being underwhelming? Was that expected? Are you surprised?
I mean, I was actually surprised. Wasn't expecting much out of it, but the success of the Russian efforts to blunt it were actually more impressive than I initially gave it credit for. I would have to say that right now you're seeing drone basically support squads being assigned to every battalion, and you really are seeing a ton of these FPV strikes and Lancet strikes, and that's just only going to get that's only just going to get more and more impressive with the scaling up of production. There was a sort of the video basic promotion of the Lancet factory, and they basically were showing off racks and racks of Lancet drones that are being, and this was a facility that was converted from a shopping mall last year, and it's just hitting its stride. And they're talking about their new efforts to also create drone swarms of Lancets that are essentially autonomous and can sort of to hunt autonomously. They've been running these kinds of tests, and when you have that, again, like we're entering a new generation of warfare. Last year and up until now, it's been this like tail end of the Cold War, and now you're beginning to see the integration of sensor fusion and various drones of various types. It's just
let me.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I just don't want to get too much in the weeds on the weaponry, at least not yet. The other thing, I just changed the title while you were speaking, because something I want to focus on, Khaleesi, Sully, and all sorts. One thing I want to focus on is also get everyone's thoughts on the mutiny. I think it was one of the biggest news. Yeah. So I'll go to another speaker. But guys, I'm genuinely curious. I know a lot of you joined.
Can I just say something on it that was kind of curious? Okay. So I was always kind of trepidatious about how this is going to end up, but just recently there was a statement from a Wagner spokesman on what they're doing, and the look of total defeat and bafflement on his face. Like, I mean, when I look at that, like I'm actually less concerned, because what actually happened, basically he was like, "Yeah, we got to rally around the president. we were in Belarus. I guess we're going to do whatever they asked us to do. And basically, it's just like this guy's like complete baffled. He doesn't know why he's there or what he's doing. It's just basically, it's essentially exile. So in that sense, like they're politically neutralized, and
But
Prigozhin
what do
himself
you?
is
But
neutralized.
guys, also so you co-hosted that space. You spent hours and hours on it, 24 hours. It was one of the most surreal experiences we've had. My question to you, man, is what the fuck happened? Because I thought we'll get more clarity as time passes. It just seems more and more confusing. We found out that they met. They searched his homes. I mean, they confiscated passports and money, and we're seeing rumors about generals getting arrested. What do we know as fact? What are the rumors, and what do you make out of all this, also?
So
Like,
I think one of the important.
are the rumors about an ongoing power struggle in the Kremlin?
So what I
Do
think
they have any
is
grounds?
So I think what's interesting, Mario. So I think Sorokin, the famous, deputy of the Ukrainian, Russia's command for the Ukrainian operations. He's for all intents and purposes, he's probably still in jail. And I think what we're seeing, Mario, is the interesting aspect is just recently, I believe 2 or 3 days ago, or actually maybe a little bit longer, but a key, Russian commander, the commander of the 58th Combined Arms Army, basically, a 3-star general equivalent to the U.S., Popov, he was fired by Gerasimov and Shoigu for openly criticizing the Ministry of Defense, the leadership, both of them, Shoigu and Gerasimov, for the execution of this war. So what Prigozhin and his led to mutiny, or whatever we want to call it, was his hatred for Prigozhin and Shoigu. We're seeing that type of rhetoric continue on to now actual Russian military generals. The clearest example, yes, is Popov right now, who has been effectively fired because he's complained of how the execution, and he's in charge for a lot of the southern front in Zaporizhia, the Russian defense there, and he's been complaining like, I don't have enough forces, I don't have enough ammunition, I don't have an effective reserve, etc. Everything that Prigozhin is hitting him, and we're seeing that permeate within more Russian senior commanders currently in Ukraine. And I think that brings up an interesting situation of where we might see this lead off, and if a further breakdown of Russian command and control.
So you think that the generals have more courage to stand up to Putin, or at least complain openly, and Putin doesn't have the same powers as he had prior to the mutiny? Is that the I want to get Patrick's thoughts afterwards.
I think Putin has kind of distance himself from this internal conflict within the Russian Ministry of Defense. But this is no longer just a Wagner, Prigozhin versus Gerasim and Shoigu. It's more widespread. We're seeing reports of Topolinsky. He's the general officer in the Russian, in charge of Russian airborne units, the VDV. Reports still unconfirmed that he might have been fired or even detained. We've had Russian brigade commanders and colonels being fired because of issues of how they've been executed and their complaints as well. And it looks like Shoigu and Gerasimov are trying to put a lid on public discontent within the Russian general staff. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot. And a lot of this is actually coming from Russian military bloggers saying a lot of these senior commanders, colonels, and generals are being removed in position. And that idea of Prigozhin's criticism of Shoigu and Gerasimov is becoming to be more, widespread, the belief of just Shoigu and Gerasimov being completely incompetent in the execution of this war.
Patrick, would love to get your thoughts.
I don't really have much to say about this drama because I hear a lot of speculation and people quoting various sources, and I just don't think it's consequential. I think there's a lot of people that are hoping, they want things to happen. They want to see a breakdown of command and control in the Russian military. And we've been told by our media and by Western political voices and so-called experts and military analysts that Russia is fighting with shovels and they're buffoons and they don't know what they're doing.
But Patrick, I'll frame the question a different way too, Patrick. So there's two ways I look at this. On one side of the argument, I would love you to break it down or get your thoughts on it. On one side of the argument, it just shows weakness on the Kremlin side for Wagner to be able to advance so quickly and to get the support of the members of the Russian military, including high-level members, according to various reports. And otherwise, he wouldn't be able to advance so much. So being able to advance so quickly and get so close to Moscow just shows weakness on the Kremlin side. The other side of the argument, though, is that
that's not true.
Putin. I'll make the other side. I'll make the other side and then get your thoughts. The other side is Putin's ability to crush it relatively quickly, and maybe the argument of him intentionally not destroying the advancement. But I don't know if you can make that argument because he had planes strike Wagner, the Wagner troops that were advancing. But Putin, his ability to end the mutiny, or whatever you want to call it, within a few hours, less than a day, maybe shows the opposite. There, he has a strong grip on the military and his group. So, which argument do you think makes more sense?
No, neither argument. I think it's a false. I think there's a false dichotomy that's being painted there. The reality is, Russia's a coherent, modern, advanced nation state and a nuclear power. And while this might have been possibly a mutiny of sorts within the Ministry of Defense and its private military outgrowth, it's neither here nor there in the larger scheme of things. I'm sure tempers are hot. A lot of people have died. Prigozhin's lost a lot of men, and he's quite a flamboyant character, which we've talked about previously in previous incidences. So that's a known factor. He's a celebrity. Wagner's are a celebrity brand. That is a popular brand in Russia. They're an aspirational brand. Their patriotism is attached to that brand. So this is a very sensitive dance that you have to do there. You can't just go and shut Wagner down just like that and put a hammer on Prigozhin's head. It has to be done delicately and elegantly, because there's a lot of high emotions running in the country. They're in a major war. They're fighting against the whole of the power of NATO. Russia is, and this is they viewing this as existential conflict. So not an easy thing. But to think that there was any chance of any overthrow or any coup or anything like that, I think is just patently ridiculous. But that's just, we all know that by now. But what matters, Mario, is what happens on the battlefield. And it's funny that Ukraine wasn't able to capitalize on this supposed chaos within the Russian system. Not at all, in fact. And what does that tell you? Prigozhin probably chose his weekend very carefully, knowing that there will be Ukraine is their counteroffensive is a non-starter, and it's a good time to maybe bang your pots and pans together for more money, or to not be absorbed into the Russian MOD, or who knows what the main issues are. There's plenty of main issues to look at, but it's funny he chose that week, and there was no movement at all on the Ukrainian side, which I thought was I was surprised. I thought they'd maybe take advantage of the instability on the Russian side, but that didn't happen. So what does that tell you? That Ukraine is extremely weak militarily. And now they've admitted, New York Times, that the counteroffensive has been canceled. Well, in truth, it never started. And that's how bad the situation is for Kiev.
Thanks, Patrick. I did want to ask you a question on the Black Sea Initiative, but I'm going to come back to that. I'd like to go to Oliver next. Oliver, what are your thoughts?
Where do you want to start? The bridge, the mutiny? What do you want to start with?
Let's start with the mutiny, and then we can move on to the bridge.
Yeah,
Well,
thoughts on what Patrick said, just talk about whatever you want in the mutiny, but in addition to that, the question is, that's what I thought. I thought when this rebellion happens, this mutiny happens, you'd have a scenario where Ukraine's able to zero in and basically, advance or make certain positive moves. Patrick said that didn't happen. What's your thoughts?
There's no point of stopping your enemy while they're trying to make a mistake. People that tried to imply that this mutiny wasn't a real mutiny. Russia lost 6 helicopters during the mutiny. They lost an IL-22M airborne command center with their entire crew. An aircraft they only have 20 of. They lost 3 electronic warfare helicopters that they only had 18 of at the start of the war. They lost 2 previously. These are very valuable assets for them, that are some of the most valuable assets they have, that were lost during this. During the mutiny, Putin came out and said, initially, they kind of put a bounty on Prigozhin's head and said, enemy of the state, and wanted to arrest him and stuff. After the mutiny kind of backed off, Putin came up, held his speech that was anticipated by many and kind of turned out to be nothing at all, where he basically ended up just thanking Wagner for not really deposing him, and then things just kind of washed out in the sand, and nothing's really happened out front right now. I'm sure there are a lot of things happening in the background with people being arrested and kind of purges going on behind the scenes. And there's also, I'm pretty sure that this mutiny won't be the first one. I'm sure that there'll be other things that are, right now we have talk on Russian sources about different generals kind of disagreeing with the things that are going on here and there and the way things are being supplied. I also don't think that you could really say that the counteroffensive has failed. I mean, the initial plan for the counteroffensive, as far as it seems, was to try to make a quick push through the line, see if they could break through rapidly like they did in Kharkiv, which worked out for them then. That didn't work. I don't think they really much of an expectation that it would work, because I mean they've had almost a year to fortify this part of the part of occupied Ukraine. So I mean it went slower. It will go slower. They've since changed tactics. I mean it's the main videos you see of Ukrainian losses are still from the first 2 or 3 days of the counteroffensive from different angles. They keep showing them again and again. I mean, in the last 2 weeks or so, if you look at casualties on either side, the Ukrainian kind of objective has shifted a lot to counter battery fire. They're destroying a lot of artillery pieces, a lot of different MRLS pieces. They're using Storm Shadow now, not just against command and control infrastructure, but also against logistics hubs. There was a large explosion at a known logistics hub in Luhansk, 2 days ago, I think it was now. That was, I mean, that's a place we've known about since November, where they had large amounts of ammunition, fuel, storage, command and control points that was previously outside of HIMARS range. Now that they have Storm Shadow, they could hit that, cause massive explosions, forces the Russians to move valuable supplies even further back. Previously, they were forced to move them about 100 kilometers back. Now, in theory, if they want to be safe, they have to move them 250 kilometers behind the front line, which will, again, kind of weaken their lines. It makes it harder for them to resupply. It's going to be a battle of attrition at this point. It's not going to be a quick break. If there happens to be a break somewhere, things will go fast. I don't think it's going to be a quick counteroffensive. I think it will go slow. There'll be casualties, heavy casualties on both sides. I don't think anything else was ever expected. I do think saying that the offensive has failed is definitely not a correct assumption to make.
It's not me saying it though. That's admitted by the United States, by their allies. You know, so it's not my opinion.
But I mean, the New York Times article,
I'm just relaying.
kind of.
I'm just relaying what the government's saying. So.
I mean, the New York Times article had basically people misinterpreted the title. They said 20% of the forces were lost. It was 20%. They had 20% casualties in the first wave, which was in total about 4% of their counteroffensive forces suffered.
But after 3 months, of no progress, that's not an offensive. That's just a non-event. It's a PR offensive. That's what the counteroffensive has been.
I mean, if you look at the amount of artillery
public relations. It's wishful thinking to think it's anything more than a public relations offensive, and it's, to me, a abject failure from any military point of view.
I mean, as someone who spent countless hours actually looking at the numbers and losses and actually knows what's going on many of the fronts, it's not a failure. It's basically what anyone that actually put their head and actually knew what was going to happen expected was going to happen. There's been I'll agree that there's been a lot of maybe overly positive thinking from a lot of people, especially in the West, about how this offensive would just kind of go without any trouble. I mean, some people were expecting to go like Kharkiv or go like Kherson offensive, where Russia kind of, withdrew forces here and there to kind of fall back to more defensible lines. I don't think anyone in a position to decide anything or actually have any real influence expected that to happen. There are definitely people and grifters on Twitter and in the media that expected that because they didn't actually know what was going on the ground. But I don't think anyone in a position of power expected that. Everyone knew this was going to be a long, hard counteroffensive with heavy casualties on both sides.
What about Biden saying Russia has lost? What about Biden coming out and saying Russia has lost straight up?
Well, I mean, if you look at their initial kind of plans for the whole 3-day special military operation, I mean, they have lost. I mean, what have they gained? They've gained basically nothing.
Let's look at that. The initial plans were denazify the area, right? They say it was going to be, they set a date they would be done by that stuff. Did Russia set a date?
I'm sorry, what?
Did Russia set a date? for denazifying.
Well, that was a 3-day military operation, so usually I'd say the date is probably about 3 days after they started. You know, I've had to make a
show me
guess.
where they ever said a 3-day military operation. They never said that one time.
It's a special military operation. It was supposed to take 3 days.
No, it was not.
But
You're making that up.
You're okay. Just for a second. You're
General
expecting that
Milley
they're
said that, not Russia. General Milley said that, not Russia.
Right.
no, but just listen to me for a second. So you're saying that they expected to suffer about 75,000 casualties
Okay,
or deaths
let's
at this
go over
point
that.
with
They did
approximately-
not say 3 days, and she just pointed out Miller said that, not Russia. It meant that was.
But Lee, you're ignoring Russia's state media consistently during the start of this
I work
invasion,
for
right
I
before
work
and
for
constantly.
Sputnik.
Yes, and Russian state media has consistently
No,
pushed the
we have
narrative
not.
that Russia was going to lose. Okay, Lee, we can get all the Russian.
I
get the
work
Russian
for-
propagandists
I
who
work for
came
Sputnik.
online and said it would be very clear.
We work for.
So
I work
all the
for
videos showing
Sputnik.
that they said that is a lie.
We've never said it would be very quick. In fact, we said just the opposite. We've had guest after guest on my show on Sputnik, so it would take months. And so, look, when someone's proven she was right, Miller said that, not Russia. And this person has not even admitted that he said something the opposite of what is true. So I don't see any point in going on.
No, just I just want to see, was the plan from the start? I just want to hear, was the plan from the start to be bogged down now? We're closing in on 2 years, or 1.5 years since the invasion. You've lost 75,000 dead, approximately. You've got another 120,000 wounded. You've achieved none of your goals.
To end it as quickly as possible, but they never set a date. At no point did Russia set a date. And expert after expert has come on my Sputnik show and said this will be a long slog. No one said 3 days, and we now know that came from
Saying
Milley.
expert in Sputnik.
What? Right.
Look,
So
she's right. Millie did say it, but Millie got it from FSB leaked documents that showed that the expectation, the expectation was they would have it 3. They're the FSB documents. You can argue with them all you want.
I do argue with him. I don't believe Milley. I don't trust him as a source for things when it contradicts what Putin himself said. First off, I don't believe Milley.
So you trust Putin. Everything Putin says is true.
Okay.
Okay.
Look, I did not say that. If you want to try to reduce, I get the game you're playing. In fact, Putin never said that. Then you could turn around. Okay, so everything Putin says is true. I don't know. He may cheat on his taxes. He may lie to his dentist. I don't know that. But he did not say that about 3 days ever. That's not an official Russian position ever. And no one will admit that. So I don't see any purpose in dealing with people who lie. Stop lying.
I'm not lying. I'm telling you what the FSB document says.
It's a ridiculous debate.
Goodbye. Goodbye. I'm not going to be insulted. Fuck you.
Fuck you.
Okay. It's ridiculous, though. We're having a retrograde debate about semantics of what someone said, whether it's 3 days or whatever. The reality is Ukraine has lost a significant amount of its territory. It's not going to get it back. Okay, they've hemorrhaged half their population. Their GDP is probably roughly half of what it was before. The currency's in free fall, and there are probably a couple 100,000 soldiers dead. You're not talking about no one likes to talk about the Ukrainian side of the casualties. Now, this is, I know, a sore point, but it's a very craven attitude for people in the West to say it's okay to keep fighting down to the last Ukrainian. And that's exactly what's happening. And to me, it's just disgusting.
Yep.
Can I
So
ask you a
Patrick,
question real
look,
quick?
I agree with a lot of the stuff you say, Patrick, but I tell you what, here's where I think it gets a little disingenuous. And I'm not saying you, I'm just saying the argument, okay? So this isn't an attack on you. I remember last winter quite well, and every day that Russia was gaining 100 meters or 200 meters towards Bakhmut, that Russia was advancing and they were victorious, and this was great. And now you have situations where on a far larger front, not just one location, but on a far larger front, you've got Ukraine making, and I won't even say modest gains. I agree with you. Their advances are nothing what they expected. But the people who are very, very supportive of Russia would say that this is horrible and they're not advancing, but yet they're the same people just 6 months ago who were so proud when Russia lost 400 dudes to gain 100 meters. It was ridiculous. So I think we all need to recage a little bit here and talk about what is advancing, what is achieving a win and what is not?
Well, achieving a win, official policy from NATO, from heads of state and NATO, and from Ukraine itself, is that they're going to, evict Russia from Crimea, which is kind of a joke, if you think about it, and that they're going to regain the Donbass territories. That's just a pipe dream. All that is precluding any peace negotiations whatsoever, and that is the official NATO policy. It's utter insanity. But that's the
That
whole
NATO
design.
policy
That's the
is based-
design. Excuse me, but that's the design of this exercise, is to have a protracted, open-ended war. And people in the West do not, and I'll repeat this, do not give a damn about how many dead Ukrainians it takes to exhaust this and turn whatever's left, a dysfunctional, landlocked rump state around Kiev or Lviv or what. Nobody quite knows. This is just utter insanity. What is the exit strategy? What is the realistic? It's not going to be Ukraine getting its 1991 borders unless you do an ethnic cleansing campaign of Crimea, and that's not going to happen.
The NATO, first of all, this isn't a NATO war. So whatever the NATO leaders want,
this is a NATO war, Jeff. It's fully funded, armed by the United States and its allies. This is the
proxy
perfect
war.
This is a 100% a proxy war.
I didn't interrupt you, Patrick. I didn't interrupt you. Let me finish.
No, because you're talking absolute rubbish, Jeff.
No, I'm not. A proxy war.
You're being intellectually dishonest.
Show me the one NATO soldier.
You're smarter than that,
one NATO soldier ordered.
You're way smarter than that, Jeff.
Show me the one NATO soldier that has been U.S., German,
you're just pushing
France,
propaganda
Spain.
lines, Jeff. You're way smarter. You know it's a proxy war. Do not pretend it's anything else.
I didn't say it's a war. I said this is not.
It's a NATO.
War.
NATO's. United States is paying the pensions of civil
God,
servants
dude,
in Ukraine.
Show me the soldier.
It's a protectorate.
There isn't one.
It's a joke.
Patrick, I literally agree with you on a lot of stuff. Please stop, man. You're killing me. All right. Look, I don't necessarily agree that it is a great situation. But when you say what NATO leaders want, it doesn't matter. The Ukrainians and the Ukrainian leadership believe that they want to get this back, and as long as they believe that they still have a chance to do that, they're not going to give up. You're nowhere near even getting to a ceasefire or a peace agreement. So you can blame
no agency. Ukrainian leadership has zero agency. Zero agency. They are a proxy. They're paid and bought and paid for. They're told what to do. They're given their reconnaissance, their targeting information, their weapons, everything. We've got our people out there running their military, Jeff. The U.S. is running their military. Britain is running their military. You got to be kidding me, Jeff. You can't be making this argument, honestly.
No, come on. You can't be making yours.
Let's be clear, Colonel, just question and then continue with what you want to say. Because I think you're not answering his question, or you're both talking past each other. So do you agree with Patrick's position, specifically at this point, that this is a proxy war?
Yes, the word I believe proxy war. I've said yes, it's a proxy war.
So you don't disagree. Sorry, continue. You were going to say something. I just wanted to make sure, because I felt like you were both talking past each other.
Right. Sorry, can I just add to that, Colonel, 1 second? So you agree it's a proxy war, but where you're disagreeing with Patrick is that it's not America at war. Then is that correct?
What I'm saying is Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership get to make the rules, right? They get to say what they want to do, other than for a few simple rules like, hey, you can't fly F-16s deep into when you get your F-16s. You can't fly them deep into Russian territory, right? There are some limits that have been placed on weapons. Other than that, they can do whatever they want. Look, I don't, and by the way, I'm not a big fan of the Biden administration. I don't understand why he sent cluster munitions at the time he did, right? I will be critical of the Biden administration, just like I'm critical of others. I try to not be one-sided. What I mean by being critical about this is, imagine this, right? The vast majority of NATO nations out there have signed the cluster ban munition, right? So why would you, when you want to go to a NATO summit and you want to show how strong NATO is and how unified NATO is, why just weeks before, or days before the summit, would you go, hey, I'm going to send a weapon that's banned by a large portion of the world, and then I'm going to force my NATO allies to go, hey, that was a good call. You can't. And you give talking points to Russia and to the West to say, how unified of the nation is how unified is NATO when some nations out there are actually slamming what the United States did versus actually supporting it. right after the NATO summit, he comes out and says, hey, you know what? We've agreed on to the F-16 training schedule, which is absolute horseshit. They haven't. There's a lot of issues with the F-16 inside the Biden administration, which is absolute bullshit. They're trying to appease and they're placating to their NATO allies and to Ukraine on this. But that would have been a far better statement to come out with first, before the NATO summit, and then actually send in the cluster munitions. So I don't understand what the Biden administration is doing.
Okay, but when you say it's a proxy war, but yet Ukraine is calling the shots, then that's a little bit of a contradiction, right? Because I think Ukraine has been quite explicit, and Patrick, please correct me if I'm wrong or not, that the US is providing specific targeting information, correct?
Providing everything. U.S. is providing everything. We have
Providing
specialists
intelligence is
with
not providing
every
targeting
single weapon
information.
system as U.S. specialists. We've had people on the ground, the British SAS, the SB, the Special Boat Service, and you name it. Okay, a satellite reconnaissance, every intelligence, everything. So they listen. They can't do anything without the United States and Britain and the NATO partners. It's a completely remote controlled regime in Kiev, and that's the fact. If
So let
they
me
cut
ask you
this,
this, Patrick. If 10 pieces of intelligence, 10 locations that are known locations that are on a targeting target packages that are given to the Ukrainian MOD, who picks and selects which ones of those targets will be targeted, when they'll be targeted, and how they'll be targeted? Does the United States do that? Does the British SAS do that? Or does Ukraine get to actually run this war from a strategic level and pick on how targets are made? Tell me that.
well, why is Zelensky's close security team British? Answer me
So
that,
you're
Jeff.
answering a question with a question because you
No,
know the
no.
answer.
I'm
Ukraine
telling
gets
you.
to make the choice.
I'm telling you. Command and control is NATO, and that is a fact. And you know
His
that,
protection
Jeff.
team is
You
there to
know
protect
that.
him, not to choose what weapons they.
I'm just giving you an example how deep the penetration of NATO personnel is, literally right around the
Patrick,
president.
can you answer that question
himself.
though of who decides the targeting package, who decides where the offensive happens, who decides what units of Ukrainian military get to what front? It's the Ukrainians.
No,
decide.
it's not.
And
That's so naive to think it's the
so
Ukrainians.
every Ukrainian who comes on
It's
this
happening
space,
in Ramstein.
every
okay?
Ukrainian who has
It's
come to this
happening in
space has
Stuttgart.
said this is not a proxy war. I'm just going to be the voice of
You guys are
every single
smoking
Ukrainian,
some
and
great whatever you're
Patrick,
smoking. I'd love to have some.
Ramstein is where USAFE and NATO air is at. UCOM actually in Stuttgart is where ground wars are actually planned and scheduled for the United States. So if you're going to start spouting stuff, please spout something that's right.
Or whatever. Take your pick of 1,000 military establishments around the world, the United States. Doesn't matter. That's a semantic
Why would
argument.
they plan an air campaign?
If
they don't
you
even have
think
airplanes.
we're going to plow,
an air base.
Hold on, Jeff. Get real. $100 billion, and you don't think we're going to be like running military affairs on every level? Okay. So ridiculous.
$100 billion is budget dust in the U.S. military.
Right, it's nothing. Yeah, and the weapons.
It's something to homeless people. It might
and
be
all
something
the
to you, but in military construct, $100 billion over multiple years.
Well,
it's nothing. We spent $24 trillion in freaking Afghanistan, dude.
It's a protectorate, and that comes with strings, and that strings is they are not in a position, not on the skill level, not on. Plus, why would you gamble when you have the full might of NATO and all of the technology and the full force of the United States military? We are running the battlefield, and guess what? We're not doing a very good job, Jeff. And that's no criticism to you.
Stop.
That's
you
no criticism to your employer,
so amazing, right?
Jeff, because you work for the
verbiage
for the U.S.
eloquent.
government.
The full force of the
you
U.S.
work
military
for the U.S.
is
government,
nowhere
so
near
you're
Ukraine.
biased.
Not the full
you can't
force
make
of the
an
US
objective argument.
Stop using words.
You're
that
biased.
Are not true.
You're covering for your boss. You're covering for your boss.
You sit there and say the whole force of the U.S. military is in
Ukraine.
This is a joke. That's absolute utter horseshit.
This is a ridiculous debate. You know it, Jeff.
You're
Come
right.
on.
You're 100% correct. I agree with you.
Okay. Guys, look, I'd like to go to Anna, but just before I do, for all the people on the space, the listeners, please leave your comments and questions in the chat bubble at the bottom, and the team will be picking up all the questions, and we will be putting some selected ones to the panel. So please leave questions and comments in the chat bubble. So Anna, hi. What's your take on this? I saw you throwing some hundreds there when Patrick was talking. What are your thoughts?
So I completely agree with Patrick, obviously. I think to think that this is not a proxy war is a ridiculous statement because it is a proxy war.
But Colonel, sorry, just to clarify, Colonel did agree that it was a proxy war. I think it was all sorts who didn't believe it was.
Okay, so good. It is a proxy war. Ukraine, I am from Ukraine. I have family in Ukraine. I also have family in Russia. So I know what's happening, in both countries, kind of, because I communicate with my families constantly. So Zelensky regime is not a legitimate regime at this point, right? I mean, he does not make best decisions for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people. And there is a lot of negative feelings about him within Ukraine, especially within mothers and wives that lost their husbands. We don't see this in Western media, but there is constant protest in Kiev about this. There's also a lot of cripples that are walking in Kiev. I mean, it's just an extremely sad situation what's happening in Ukraine right now. The casualties are catastrophic. There's over 350,000 people probably have perished within this war for absolutely nothing. And Zelensky regime is actively trying to just kill off all of Ukrainians. It is crazy what's happening. The fact that we are supplying, America and NATO supplying weapons, supplying intelligence, what happened at the bridge, it was a job of CIA. The Worldview satellite has been circling within the bridge twice in the last month, taking images of the bridge and exact location actually that it was hit. Obviously, Ukraine could never possibly have done this without United States intelligence and NATO intelligence. So now what brings us to the point that Zelensky is actively trying to kill all of his people, because now Russia is going to retaliate against Ukraine, obviously, because they cannot do this against NATO for obvious reasons of Article 5. So now civil infrastructure is going to get hit again. People are going to lose power. I'm an engineer. I build power distribution systems. I build power grids. It is extremely difficult to rebuild them. It's going to take years and billions of dollars that Ukraine does not have, because once America is going to stop supplying Ukraine with money, weapons, intelligence, Ukraine is a shell of a country. It does not exist. And what we are doing, what Biden administration is also doing, is slowly walking us into World War III, because once the Russian red line is actually going to get crossed, and we're very close at this. Yesterday 2 Russian civilians have died, and Putin is extremely upset about this. I've heard him speak. He is going to do a lot of retaliation, whether it's going to be within Ukraine or potentially at one point it's going to be against NATO and the United States. And we have World War III on our hands, and that means nuclear war. So that's my take on this. We're playing an extremely dangerous game.
Thanks, Anna. Can I just ask you a question? And then I'd like to go to Austin to get his input into this. You said that you feel that Russia's red line is very close to being crossed. Where do you see that red line?
So obviously Crimea is his red line. It's something I believe I was reading news the other day. I believe that yesterday alone or a day before, they repelled 17 drones, air defense system over Sevastopol, which is if Sevastopol if Crimea is going to get hit, I think that would be his absolute red line. And I don't want to say it, but at one point, Russia is sitting on a lot of nukes and a lot of tactical nukes. And at what point are you going to use them against Kiev regime? I mean, they have them for a reason, obviously. So, and then this is where World War III starts. So, again, we're very close to that line, in my opinion. I live this war. So if something's going to happen to actual Crimea Peninsula, I think that's going to be his red line.
Thanks, Anna. Austin, thanks for joining on the panel. What are your thoughts on this? So is it a proxy war, which I think generally there's been agreement on, but whether or not it is the USA calling the shots is the thing that's being, the disputing factor here. And also, what are your thoughts on what's happening right now, and whether or not you think that the red line that Russia has, it is that red line Crimea, and if it's close to being crossed, and if we are close to World War III? Over to you.
Yeah, can you guys hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
First and foremost, I would actually disagree with the notion that this is a proxy war. Historically, if you look at sort of the concept of proxy wars throughout, the entire history of the Cold War, there's been an entire lack of agency via the proxy itself. What we do know is that, Zelensky was legitimately elected. And if the reality of the situation was Ukrainians didn't want to fight in this conflict, they wouldn't be. We've seen the largest mobilization in modern history for the Ukrainian state since the 90s. We've seen a large amount of their men and women of fighting age continue to fight on the ground there. If the reality was that this was just the U.S. pulling the strings, we would not have seen that. We would not have seen the dedication that the Ukrainian armed forces has shown previously and continues to show to this day. That being said, are there limitations being set upon the supply of specific armaments? Absolutely. However, I don't think that takes away from the individual agency nor the democratic nature of the Ukrainian state. Now, moving forward in regards to red lines, red lines are a bit of a broken record when it comes to Russia. We've heard at least over 30 red lines in the last year from them. Many of them have been crossed, and we have not seen significant escalation beyond the conventional invasion of the Ukrainian state by the armed forces of Russia. So, as I've said before in this space, and I will continue to say, I sleep happily at night knowing that nuclear war is no closer than it was previously. I do not have significant fear at the moment of nuclear escalation, nor do I expect to see that happen should we see major incidences in Crimea. However, a lot of what has just recently been said, talking about the Kerch Bridge and everything like that, NATO observers, yada, 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 we have not seen significant physical NATO military deployments to Ukraine. I understand many people have sort of touted that NATO's on the ground. The reality of the situation is, even from leaked documents internal to NATO member states, we have not seen that. So this idea that this is a NATO war against Russia in any sort of physical capacity beyond existing arms shipments is, made up. It's not real. But yeah, those are my initial thoughts. Happy to comment further.
Thanks, Austin. Let's go to Dr. Snakotron for some comments on this. One of the things that I find when people say it's not a US-led kind of war, and it is genuinely Ukraine calling the shots, it reminds me of Nord Stream 2. And I think, well, was that Ukraine calling the shots, or was it America? But Dr. Snakotron, over to you.
Hey, yeah. The thing is, I think this is just a matter of semantics. The one thing that you often find, by the way, that if you look at the history of colonialism, you look at the history of empires, like the colonized or the local actors, they actually do have quite a bit more autonomy or agency than people give them credit for. So essentially, yes, there is a broader strategic picture where the U.S. is confronting Russia and is supplying weapons and things to damage Russia. But on the local level, you also have people like Zelensky who have their own like interests and their own sort of self-preservation and their own like calculations about their own political power or whatever, and they pursue certain goals that might be more or less like they might be aligned in some ways and might not be aligned in others. I think basically what you have with Zelensky is like he's more or less like given like he's by presidential decree, which means it's legal, that he made it illegal to actually negotiate with Russia. So it's something like where if the West or if of other countries in Europe, like if they're talking about maybe negotiating, well, Ukraine has a law on the books now that says like, oh, you cannot negotiate with Russia until you recover all of Ukrainian territory. So the thing is, again, like there are many moving pieces in it. I just tell people, like, don't get fixated on the exact like definitions or where to draw the line, because the world isn't just binaries. It's a scale of gray, right? It's a gray scale formation. So in this regard, like just like, understand that the West has certain interests, Ukraine has certain interests, and the war will. And the war has different characteristics and dynamics that will determine whether or not, like, who will have the final say. Because there's potentially a possibility that even if the West calls off support, like Ukraine will continue to fight out of something like nationalist irredentism. Like just like these kinds of things can evolve in unpredictable ways. I mean, nobody expected Zelensky to become this this maximalist irredentist back in 2022, but here we are, right?
Can I ask Dr. Snooker a question?
Sure.
So Zelensky ran in the presidential election elected in 2019. He ran on an anti-war peace ticket. That was the referendum. That was his mandate, and to push the Minsk process forward. But so based on this, right? If they had a referendum.
Well, let me finish.
Let me ask the question to you, and then we can have a dialogue. But if you had a referendum today, which unfortunately is not going to happen because elections have been suspended, if you had a referendum today, if the same Ukrainian people who elected him on a peace ticket, a peace with Russia, if they had a referendum today, what do you think the people of Ukraine, not Zelensky, but the people of Ukraine would want? Would they want to carry on an open-ended war, or would they want to sit down and put an end to it and draw a line where we're at?
I mean, it depends on what the terms of those talks are, and also bear in mind, many of the people who gave Zelensky his mandate were people in the Donbass who will not be able to vote.
But he had 70%. He got 70%, so he's got a mandate right the way through the country. So it's a pretty good indication, isn't it, that that's generally what people wanted, right?
Well, here's the difference is Zelensky's own interest. Like, this is where you have to follow his own political trajectory, because what actually happened after 2019, everybody talks about 2019, nobody talks about 2020 when he effectively lost control of his own party. And then he did the thing that many Ukrainian politicians have done, which is like then try to form alternative structures of power to do an end run around the Rada, which he did through the National Defense and Security Council. So basically from late 2019, 2020 onwards, he styled himself as a national security hard ass. And that was the way that he was actually going to reinvent his role. And from 2021 onwards, you really saw like a tendency for him to sort of escalate in the Donbass. This is before the 2022 like special military operation or war, or whatever you want to call it. Like, basically, he kind of prefigured his own popularity. He kind of prefigured like his image, his popularity, his credibility on this idea of confronting Russia. Like let me remind you, before the war kicked off, what actually happened was he was locked in like a political battle with President Poroshenko, and he was trying to put Poroshenko in jail because while Poroshenko was president, he bought coal from the Donbass. And according to his own National Security Council, this was Poroshenko funding terrorism. So this kind of paranoia and insane political behavior is all and irredentance of was basically a hallmark of his administration from 2020 onwards.
But that's good background, and that's really, I'm glad you outlined that, Doctor. But what about the people though in Ukraine? With a lot of talk of democracy and how we need to preserve democracy.
They rewarded him.
What do they want? Do the people really want to carry on an open-ended war like this?
Well, the thing is, one thing
Yes,
that he noted was that he received a small boost in popularity every time he did like persecutions of Russians or did escalation in the Donbass. It never really stuck until the war, though. So he would go from like 25 to 35%.
Dr. Snectron, I think what Patrick's asking is, if there was a referendum today, hypothetically, to the people of Ukraine, do you think they'd want to go to the negotiating table, or do you think they would want to carry on the war? And I guess you kind of answered that by saying it depends on the terms, but you'd only know the terms once you got to the negotiating table, right?
Exactly. I mean, and the other thing is, like, there's so many different factors here too, because the question is, if like currently the Ukrainians have an idea that the West is going to give them unlimited support. If that idea changes in 6 months' time? Will they have the same estimation? Like, there's so many moving pieces here. You cannot say for sure what people want. I mean, public opinion is a dynamic thing.
Well,
They
if
can vary based
the
on-
doctor, if the West withdrew the support it's giving now, obviously they'll go straight to the negotiation table because that would be suicide to do anything else. But as it stands today,
that's actually not like guaranteed though. That's actually
I think it's guaranteed. Okay, because they're able to punch well above their weight because they have the full backing of NATO and the United States of America, which is significant. So you take that away, it's a whole different ballgame. I think that's what Donald Trump was intimating in his 24 hours it's over comment. But it'd be the threat of
I mean,
withdrawing
the thing
aid.
is, they try to fight Russia with a lot less before, and there is like people you cannot underestimate the sort of survival instinct of a cornered rat, which is what Zelensky kind of is. I mean, he was already looking at going down pretty badly to Poroshenko after his failed attempt to jail him. So, but the thing is,
at what point do you cut your losses? Because look at the trajectory of the situation. It's not in Ukraine's favor at all. So it would make sense for the country to cut its losses.
But why? But the question is, for if you were Zelensky and you were this guy who's more or less persecuting people and putting them in jail for having just buying the coal from the Donbass, and like you don't think the knife's going to come out for you when you surrender like Ukrainian territory away to Russia? The reason why he adopted this kind of insane like maximalism is because he created this cage for himself. So there's no real choice for him, his own survival, but to go forward and fight.
100%. You've nailed that completely. Because if there is negotiations, if there is any pause in fighting, obviously people are going to be looking for a scapegoat, and the closest available scapegoat will be Zelensky, and he will be accused of being a Western puppet at that point. But that conversation can't happen because they're stuck in the wartime mode, state of emergency now, and you can't have that dialogue. And in fact, you can't have any referendum period because he said democracy is suspended until we achieve our victory, which could be never. So it's a conundrum, as you said, Doctor, a total trap.
Yeah, and the way that he's operating now is like he's trying to game other members of NATO to try to put pressure on the U.S. Like he's working for Poland, working with the Baltics. And he had made a series of announcements with the president of Poland. He basically and there's a question now, like again, the speculation about this attack on the Kerch Bridge, like. Was it the CIA that had more influence, or was it MI6? There are actually sources that say MI6 had more influence on this, and it was actually a British underwater drone that so the thing is, like, you have to understand, like, not every party in this conflict has exactly aligned goals. Like, they may all want to take down Russia, but they all have their own interests as well. And right now, Ukraine, they're trying to maximize some of their alliances with like countries like Poland and Lithuania and the UK, and try to put pressure to get the US to give them more stuff. And you already saw in the U.S. media a tinge of annoyance, especially coming from out of the WAPO of all places, saying like the Zelensky's trying to guilt trip us, and Zelensky had this like plan, but almost backfired in trying to put pressure on the U.S. So, like, yeah, it's just it's unpredictable because you have like all these different actors who with slightly different interests.
Thanks, Dr. Snekotron. Can I ask, once again, people listening to the space to kindly leave all your comments and questions in the bubble on the right-hand side at the bottom, and the team will be checking comments and questions and putting them to the panel. I'd like to go to Oliver. Oliver, you've heard this debate and you've heard Patrick's thoughts about the fact that if there was a referendum today, he believes that the majority of the public will vote for peace talks. So I know you want to probably comment on some of the earlier discussion, but if you'd also answer that, please go ahead.
I think from the people that I've talked to in Ukraine, I wouldn't say the majority of people want peace talks. I think still a majority of people they're in this, and I think they're going to be in this. I mean, saying they're in this to the end kind of sounds a bit, but I think a lot of them are going to be in this for the long haul, and I think it is going to be a long haul thing, because it is in many cases an existential crisis for them. I think that remains almost as much today as it was in the early days of the war. Yeah, that's basically all I really have
So
on
what
that
do you see
point.
the outcome as ultimately?
I mean, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. It could go many ways. I think it's. I don't know. I wouldn't say it's going to be something that's going to be over in the next years. I think it's going to take a long time. I think this counteroffensive that's going on right now is going to be slow, but might have some effect once the counter battery fire and stuff starts to take hold, as it's beginning to do in the last 2 weeks, destroying a large amount of artillery system and hitting logistics targets and stuff. That will start wearing down points. I mean, in essence, you only really need to break through the line one place to start having a good foothold. There isn't very much defense in depth. A lot of it has been moved up to the front. If they can get through anywhere at some point, that can start causing trouble, wreaking havoc, different places, and that can quickly change the kind of perceived outcome of this counteroffensive very rapidly if things go that way. If they don't go that way, it might start to turn into a bit more of a stalemate. That could also happen. If that happens, though, you have different units of the Russian the Ukrainian military that are kind of probably going to be taken off the front lines. Like right now, you have Ukrainian SSO, which are their special forces, which are right now being used to storm trenches and stuff. Where if they weren't being used for that, if the kind of front lines ground to a halt, you'd be seeing a lot more operations like the one All Source talked about in Belgorod in Russia today, with ambushes of Russian convoys inside of Russia, because that's kind of the mission parameters that they're designed for and kind of what they in essence really should be doing. Stuff like this behind enemy lines. Right now, they're just being used as, to storm trenches and stuff, because they're also effective troops at that. But I mean, if you can get to a point where they're being used at that, they'd be sent doing kind of different things. I don't think the war would really stop. In any essence, it might change the way it kind of looks from the outside, but it will still be going on.
Thanks, Oliver. Michael, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting sort of points put out here, but I would point out that we're talking about a proxy war here, but remember where this effectively started, and that was with Russia's support of separatist movements in the Donbass and in Luhansk as well. And again, that's where this started. Now, if we're going to talk why won't Ukraine come to the peace table, then most of the terms that, what is going to be actually acceptable to Ukraine, frankly, everyone is more than aware that if Ukraine goes to the peace table today and says, look, okay, Russia gets to keep everything it has at the moment, but we end the war today, then all it's doing is giving Russia breathing space to effectively launch another offensive to try and capture Kiev again in probably 3 or 4 years' time. This is, why should Russia be allowed to effectively just take a bunch of its neighbors' land and secure it? Now, you can make all sorts of arguments about, moving into the Donetsk area, moving into Luhansk area, but, Mariupol is not, not even a majority Russian ethnic area. Kiev is not a majority Russian ethnic area, so there's no justification to go into that. This is Russia invading its neighbor, and for outside powers, this is a very important period of history. And frankly, if Russia got away with just annexing part of its neighbor's territory by force, that would be a giant signal to Morocco, to Algeria, to Armenia, to Azerbaijan, to China, to a whole bunch of nations, that war and changing borders via war is now back on the table. And that was something that we really should have been taking away a long time ago. Generally, Ukraine is not going to give up just because Russia says to give up. And to the other person who said that we should use nuclear weapons on Kiev, that's just insane, personally. Nuclear weapons is once you open that genie out of the bottle, there's no going back. And Russia's not going to do that. There's no chance Russia wants to start a nuclear conflict over this if they can avoid it. They can move their tactical nukes around, but the classic example is moving nuclear weapons from Novorossiysk up to effectively depots in Minsk, even though that frankly that was actually further away from the front line than when they started. Putin, again, we're talking and saying, why isn't Ukraine settling down, or why isn't Ukraine backing down, or why is Ukraine attacking Russia? We all forget that Russia was the one that walked in here. Russia was the one that invaded in 2014. But even if you want to put that aside and say they were defending Russians, which I don't believe, but you can have that argument, there's no justification for making the Thunder run to Kiev or making the Thunder run out down sort of the south of the country. You know, this is the Ukrainians defending themselves, and it would be bonkers if Canada was to come in, annex the northeast of the US, and then we're just expected to let Canada take it, regroup, and try again in 4 years. That's, you know, if I put myself in the Ukrainian shoes, I can see why I would be very hesitant to go to the negotiating table, because Putin's not going to be negotiating in good faith. I think the most likely scenario for a peace scenario, because I can't see Russia just doesn't have the strength to win this war, not without putting massive amounts of new blood into the lines and training a lot of men. That's not politically palatable at all. And I can't see Ukraine winning this either, because frankly, they're it's a hard fight. They're going against defensive positions. It's a really hard slog. The more likely scenario is what we see in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, or Transnistria, where frankly they both find semi-defensible positions, particularly rivers or hills. They all dig in, and the war just stalemates for the next effectively while. Effectively, what Donbass used to be in 2014, 2015, when we used to go out the front lines out there. You'd have 3 or 4 shells fired a day, but the front really didn't move. I think that's probably the best scenario that either side's hoping for at the moment, but neither side is going to be willing to give up. Russia can't afford, or Putin definitely can't afford politically to, lose all these Russian lives and come back with nothing. And Zelensky can't just give up half his, a whole bunch of territory and give Russia the green light to, gather up their forces and try again in a few years. So I think it's pretty disingenuous to say the Ukrainians should just accept their fate or cop a nuke, which is a pretty odd thing to say.
I think it was more around what the public would want, if there was a referendum. But see, Michael, I'm listening to yourself and Oliver, and I'll go to Patrick in a second. So when you say that neither side would give up, it may go into stalemate, it will, Oliver said it would continue for the foreseeable. On the Russian side, they're fighting this on their own 2 feet. But on the Ukrainian side, there's a massive dependency on NATO support, and America continuously and the UK continuously arming them. And that dependency is the backbone of Ukraine continuing this. So when we say it will continue, it's assuming that would continue as well.
So what you're arguing, though, is that any big nation should be able to just absorb the little nation around it.
Not at all, Michael.
So why shouldn't we be able to keep nations free?
Yeah, no, I understand your point. I'm not arguing any position. I'm just saying that when we say the 2 countries will continue, we have to also mention that one of them is dependent on massive support from other NATO countries. And it's on the assumption, because Anna earlier, when she was speaking, she actually said it's only a matter of time before the US stops funding this militarily and by weapons. And when that happens, but she actually believes it's not a given that NATO countries will carry on funding this. Let me go to Patrick, and I'll come back to you. Patrick,
can I just put one quick point in there?
Yeah,
NATO has spent effectively 0.3% of its, the US budget. US defense budget has been spent on this conflict. Most of the weapons given to Ukraine have been stuff that's probably going to get mothballed anyway, and it's probably good to see them actually get out there and do stuff with it. This is not a huge dent in the US or even NATO's budget, so they can continue this conflict for quite a long time. Procurement-wise, it's also given a lot of impetus for a lot of the defense industry to effectively build large-scale things, like particularly artillery shells, that they haven't been doing for a very long time. So that's, I don't think this is, contingent on the US is going to pull out anytime soon. And again, I will put it down and I'll say it again. If Russia gets away with this, then that sends a giant signal to a lot of other countries that war is now a viable option to change borders by force. And that's something that I would be very worried about if I were living in the Caucasus or Central Asia or North Africa, or even on the borders with China. It's not a precedent I would prefer to set.
Michael, I think you're forgetting that it's election year in the United States, and this war is not popular.
No, okay. The war actually has a large popularity. The war is actually extremely popular in the United States. Even when you start,
I live in the United States, it's not popular.
Yes, but the polling is suggesting that the war is quite popular. It may not be popular amongst the mega Republicans, but it's popular amongst the general public.
Okay.
Patrick, let's come to you. What are your thoughts on what Michael's just said? And then I'll go to Danny. Go ahead, Patrick.
I think
Patrick, I asked you a question as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
And then just add on wherever you wanted to. So, I mean, Michael made the argument that it's no issue because they're using old stock. But from what I know, that they were using old stock, but it ran out, and replacement is very expensive. So if you can add more information on that, that'd be brilliant.
I can add more information on that if need be. Yes, the old stock that came in at the very beginning was effectively everyone clearing out their stockpiles. Most of, particularly some of the Eastern Europeans or Central European nations, had a lot of old Warsaw Pact gear sitting around. So pretty much anyone who had anything that fired 152 mil shell was just, they chucked it in a crate and sent it across. Yes, a lot of these, particularly European nations, have used this to clean out their stocks, and they'll go get new NATO material. But what we're also seeing in this time is a huge development, in particularly not only NATO shells and whatnot, which will be donated to Ukraine. You know, we're seeing a lot of Bradleys and a lot of US equipment rocking up in the battlefield in Ukraine, but we're also seeing massive upgrades of arms development and procurement strategies in Romania, in Germany, in Poland, in Bulgaria as well, and the United States. You know, arms manufacturers in the United States are now pumping out 152 millimeter shells to be able to supply Ukrainian cannons. You know, that's as much as people say we've cleaned out the stocks, and yes, Poland is buying, you know, they get rid of all their Warsaw Pact stuff, and they're now buying South Korean tanks, weirdly enough.
So actually, can I add something on that just quickly?
Because
I think there's a misconception when we're talking about Western equipment. So, like, for example, two specific examples, like when we're talking about the Bradleys, right? People think that's a modern system. The specific Bradleys that were sent to Ukraine's the M2A2 are out of stock in the U.S. military. We do not use the M2A2 variant. The variant that is used now is the M2A3, right? The M2A2s are not being used. We have hundreds and hundreds of those just sitting around. The Abram tanks is the M1A1 variant. That is no longer in use in the U.S. military. It is all the M1A2 SEP3 variants of the U.S. military. We have a shit ton of M1A1s just sitting around that are not doing. Even the Europeans, if you look at the Leopards, a lot of the Leopard 2A4s are being phased out for the Leopard 2A6. So when we're talking about this new equipment that's going in, even the Western equipment that's coming through to Ukraine that you might think, oh, this is new. Those are old, that a lot of them have been disserviced by the U.S. military and by NATO military, because there's new variants of that equipment that's being used. And Patrick, you laugh, but I mean, the M1A1, I'm sorry, the Marines were the last ones to have it. They stopped using it because they transitioned to a Pacific Fleet. The only ones using it in the past were the National Guard. The National Guard has stopped utilizing them, are now utilizing the M1A2 version 3. And we have thousands of M1A1s literally sitting across the United States doing absolutely nothing, just collecting dust that can be easily fixed. So I think when we're talking about, Suleiman, to your point about Western equipment, and it's like, oh, well, now it's the newer stuff. These are newer stuff compared to like the Soviet equipment that many Eastern European countries had. But a lot of these equipments are no longer being utilized by the West, and they were just in storage or in reserves that we don't need anymore because there's more modern equipment that we have. And we're still giving Ukraine old stuff. Even the F-16s that are being sent to Ukraine are not the latest variants. Like, again, when we're talking about Western military equipment, we have to be very clear. This is not the latest and greatest technological equipment that we have. It's still decades in the past that are being sent to them.
Classic example, Australia has been sending Bushmasters to the Ukrainians because A, Australia is no longer doing operations inside Afghanistan. We don't particularly have much use for them. B, we were having to pay to store the things and keep them in a safe condition. And C, it actually is pretty useful for battlefields in Ukraine because they're mine resistant in the bottom of them. So yeah, it made sense that these are things that would be mothballed. Yeah, I fully agree with you.
The U.S. Army doesn't use it anymore. We have them in storage. Those are the ones that we've been giving it to cops. We're now giving it to Ukraine because they're not part of Army standard equipment anymore.
Yep. And again, the older equipment gets, if you want to keep it in storage, you need to start building old procurement stuff. You start needing to build old gearboxes. You know, it's actually easier to just get it out and effectively get it on the field rather than trying to keep these things in service far past their service life.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, Patrick, over to you, and then we'll come to you, Danny.
Yeah, I've seen some of those Bushmasters, piles of scrap metal sitting in farmland in Ukraine, as well as the Bradleys. So this is recycling, turning old gear into scrap metal and then backfilling it with new contracted kit. It's a great business model, obviously, and that's really what NATO has become, is kind of a protection racket and an arms bazaar. And they want to standardize everything across all the newly militarized Eastern European front. And according to Michael, this is a great thing, this remilitarization of Europe and society. But Michael made a lot of half-baked disingenuous arguments. One of them was that this will send a message to any big nation that they can just go and use war or change borders or whatever. What do you think the United States has been doing since World War II? And look at the situation in Syria, where the U.S. is trying to encourage a separatist Kurdish breakaway state, the Rojava, okay, occupying it militarily. Syria is a UN member state, and they're occupying it, trying to basically create a breakoff of northeastern Syria. Completely illegal, no criticism whatsoever, no moralizing coming from anybody on this panel, that's for sure, let alone the global mainstream media. And that's just one example. But this idea that borders can't change, I'm afraid the US and NATO pulled that card with Yugoslavia, and you shattered the Helsinki Final Act by creating Kosovo, tearing a piece of Serbia. And I'm not even talking about the forced breakup of Yugoslavia, which NATO did completely against Article 1 of the NATO treaty. Not the first time it's violated its own treaty, but that aside. So that argument about borders is null and void, okay? The reality is...
Can I respond to that?
No, you can't, because I'm not done making my
The
point.
forced breakup of
Michael, you
Yugoslavia
talk for
by
10
NATO?
minutes.
Are we being serious here? Are we trying to have
Yeah,
a
that
serious conversation?
So I got student Austin and Michael cutting in. Okay, listen, guys, that's the way history is written, and you wrote it. If you're backing NATO, that is your problem. Okay?
No, it's not.
You
Because
destroyed.
You're making stuff up.
Okay.
I'm not
Okay, yeah.
making stuff
No,
up.
no,
You're
so
saying
can-
Kosovo wasn't. You didn't tear Kosovo off of
No,
Serbia
that's
after
a
the
different
forced
war.
breakup of
That's a different
Yugoslavia.
war.
Austin,
Are we
put
talking
your hand
Are we
up.
talking the 90s
Get in the
here?
queue,
We're talking about
Austin.
But Patrick, okay,
Austin, I know you're a student, but put your hand up like a good
responding.
student,
First of all, don't
and
talk
we
down
will
to
come
Patrick.
to you in a minute.
I don't talk down. But Patrick, you're having a chat with me now. First of all, Yugoslavia started breaking up upon the death of Tito, but it was before NATO got involved.
No. Come on. Now you're rewriting
you know that's
history.
true.
Michael.
Okay, now the next one I want to bring up. I'll come back to that. But let's talk about you're saying that the Americans funded the Rojava movement, considering the Rojava movement's been around longer than the United States has been around.
On the ground, Michael. Are you not following the Syrian conflict?
I'm very aware of what
occupied by the U.S. military, Michael, since
No, but
2017. Michael, since 2017.
occupied. Do you want to talk about the Russian troops in Syria, or
No,
just ignore that?
I'm
Or
talking
the
about
Turkish
the
troops in Syria?
U.S. No.
So is the Russian troops
illegally?
Okay, is Turkey there illegally?
Turkey is, yeah, in violation of international law, absolutely. But
so
Turkey,
so Russia's allowed in because they got invited in.
Yeah, exactly.
So the Kurds also got invited in, and they have autonomous status in the north.
Kurds didn't get invited in. The Kurds have been
the Kurds have been there longer than the
United
States has existed as a country. You know that, right? You know the Kurds have existed longer than the United States.
Then because they weren't invited in.
You've got your geopolitics all screwed up, Michael. You're trying to make a convoluted argument, and you're failing badly. Russia is not there illegally. The United States is. Is that difficult to work out, Michael? Is that a hard one?
Okay, now that same logic, that would mean Russia is in Ukraine illegally.
By the letter of international law, yes. But this goes back to my original point, Mike. You're trying to make a liberal. You're trying to make.
No, I'm not making a liberal argument. I'm making the argument the borders can't change by force. Now you talked about breaking up Yugoslavia, which was not done by force. It was actually done by the death of Tito and ethnic tensions. Now, if you want to talk Kosovo, that's a bunch of Albanian. That's an Albanian issue down the south.
No.
Now, NATO didn't break these guys up.
You got the breakaway states along with the other.
Recognizing states is not changing borders by force. They are two different things. Germany recognizing a state.
A chain of events, and well, if you did, maybe you didn't study.
By that same logic, Russia should be guilty for recognizing South Ossetia and Transnistria and Abkhazia.
Listen, guilt, and then the United States can be guilty as well. The point is, I'm making a realist.
No, answer that question. If you think that it was wrong for Germany to recognize Yugoslavia, then why is it okay for Russia to recognize a breakaway republic?
This means that China's going to take Taiwan, and you're making this ridiculous neocon.
No, it's a fair assumption to make. And again, I said, and I didn't say China and Taiwan. I said Morocco.
And
the other thing Michael did, he said this all started when Russia recognized the separatists in Lugansk and Donetsk. He totally omits the U.S. backed a violent coup in the Maidan in February of 2014. And then they sandbagged the Minsk Accords and it's admitted
First of all, it's
they're
Minsk,
buying
not
time
Minsk. You
to
know that,
arm.
right?
They're
It's named
buying
after the
time
city it was
NATO
signed
was
in, not
buying
a
time.
furry animal.
Michael, you're being destroyed right now. Your argument does not hold
I'm
water, and you're cutting in every time. I'm sure, basically laying off the bits that you cover up to this room. You don't want people to start history earlier. You want to start it where it's convenient for your narrative. Okay, the U.S. backed a violent coup in Kiev in February of 2014. Everybody knows
Except
this.
that, again, that's
That's
not
history.
true.
And then they handpicked an illegal coup government, which the Donbass republics didn't recognize. They said it was unconstitutional. At that point, you have a violent civil war. The U.S. backs Petro Poroshenko's, quote, anti-terror operation, calling everyone in Donbass a terrorist, and then using the military against his own people. Isn't that the thing the United States decried and are sanctioning Syria for, and that NATO bombed Libya for? Yes, the same exact thing. The double standards and the hypocrisy of your argument is laid bare for everybody to see.
Can I speak now?
Let me go to Danny first, and I'll come to Michael because he's
Yeah.
had hand up for a while. Danny, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, after that exchange, my point's going to seem a little bit obsolete. I wanted to come back to I mean, of course, this is a proxy war. I mean, it's stupid to say that this is a proxy war and that Zelensky is calling the shot somehow. I mean, it's a complete contradiction. Not only does the US, well, if we're going to take it back to before the Ukraine war, before it was known as Ukraine war, it was known as the Ukraine crisis, right? Now, the Ukraine crisis in around about January, February, when things were kind of hotting up, I remember I was in the foreign ministry in Moscow. The chain of letters was going between Moscow and Washington. It was never going between Moscow and Kiev. And the only red line, I mean, red line, there are two words that make this kind of great headline. Nobody really knows, nobody this far along who's using the words red line or multiple red lines actually knows what the red line is. There's only one red line. The red line for Russia was Ukraine joining NATO and military infrastructure from NATO being placed in Ukraine on Ukrainian territory. That was the only red line. That was the only red line. Now there's pretext to the war. There's pretext to the war, of course. Vladimir Putin outlined them, the demilitarization of Ukraine, the denazification of Ukraine, and all that. Now that's all great talk. That's all posturing, but it's not measurable. You can't measure that. You can't measure the denazification of Ukraine. You can't measure the demilitarization of Ukraine. But what you can do is show that Ukraine hasn't joined NATO. Now, coming back to the point where this is a proxy war and that Zelensky isn't calling the shots, the US is calling the shots, and that goes down to the US is even drawing out the limits for this war. It's the only, or rather, it is the biggest publisher of headlines with things like the mantra of down to the last Ukrainian. It outlines the results of the war that would be favorable to Ukraine, such as winning back land, such as Crimea and the Donbass region, and NATO ascension for Ukraine. The two things that can't happen, two things that won't happen, two things that NATO even said that won't happen unless there's a Ukrainian victory. It's this carrot dangled in front of Ukraine. And so that facilitates this endless, this perpetual, this perennial wars, perennial conflict that Ukraine will keep on fighting down to the last Ukrainian. We know that each Ukrainian hardline supporter has been brainwashed into thinking that no life matters. You saw it today with the Crimean Bridge. Obviously, it's not the first time that it's been attacked. But this couple that had been killed, I remember back in October, people were making all sorts of arguments for, oh, well, they attacked the bridge when there weren't going to be that many people there. So it doesn't really matter. And now, oh, well, what are they doing holiday making down there? I mean, they've got their kid with them. It's kind of their fault, really. I mean, we know that these people have been brainwashed into thinking that any life that is sacrificed, any life that is lost, it doesn't matter if it's Ukrainian, Russian, or whoever, it is justified in this war, this endless war. And the only results and the only things that can be obtained are completely unobtainable. They're things that won't materialize. And that feeds back into the point. There's one point I wanted to make about Putin saving face at the negotiating table. I mean, what face? I mean, these people don't really understand the Russian public. Vladimir Putin has already acted. Vladimir Putin has already garnered so much support from the Russian public by initiating what's happening in Ukraine, and by standing up to the West, standing up to NATO, and going on this quest to place Russia again on the position it was when it was the USSR, a great country of great reverence and respect, and was someone that was feared on the geopolitical stage. I've made this point many a time before in spaces. That's where Vladimir Putin gets his support from. All these intricacies of, Sweden joining NATO and Finland, the border being extended and all that. People don't really give a toss. What they do give a toss about is Putin having actually done something for Russia, and anything that goes, such as anything that. Sorry if I can get my words out. And any of these attacks or anything that comes from the West in terms of financial military aid towards Ukraine is validating and is justifying Putin's words that Russia has.
Danny, can I ask you a question though? I think because you're saying that the red line was
right.
Ukraine
That is the one red line.
Yeah. But so my question to you then is, if that's the case, then why when Putin initiated his entire, but right before February 24th, 2022, and the speech that initiated this war, and the speeches in the past, and since we've seen in the future, even to this day still, Putin's entire argument has consistently been that the notion of a Ukrainian nation state is bullshit. That is non-existent. That Ukraine has always been Russia, shall always be Russia, and this is deep-seated since the time of the Soviet Union and the Imperial Russian time. Like, this idea of Ukrainian nationhood is bullshit, and that is well permeated throughout Russian space, and they continue to make that argument. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, I think that argument is pretty much won by the fact that Ukraine is being controlled by the US and NATO in this proxy war. I mean, I think the argument, it argues itself. I mean, your point is completely defeated by the fact that, Zelensky isn't there calling the shots. If you want to make it a point for this, for Ukraine being a puppet state, for it not being a real nation, then I think you just got to look at what's going on. You got to look at the fact that, I mean, the question to you is, I can't remember before whether you said that you agree this is a proxy war or not, whether Ukraine's been propped up on all corners, on all fronts by the US or NATO. But what did you say? Did you say yes or no?
No, I do not believe that this is a proxy war. And I just want to go back to, though, you can twist and say, well, they don't exist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, oh, well, and you can kind of twist the words and everything. But again, when you look at Russia's propaganda, you look at Putin's speech, and you look at everything that has been said, the idea of a Ukrainian independent nation state in the borders of 1991 has always been an antithesis of what Russia believes is actually should be there. They always believe Ukraine is inherently Russian. It should be part of the Russian territory of the Russian state, and period. And they've vocalized this multiple times consistently. And I think we're just ignoring that fact. And I think that's not right. I think we have to call it out that Russia doesn't believe Ukraine should be an independent state.
No, well, I'll answer that on two fronts. But the first thing that I would say is the fact that it's been more vocal that this returning Russia to the USSR has got nothing to do with this ever expanding border and like hoovering up the former Soviet states and Soviet satellite states or anything like that. It's been returning Russia to the reverence and respect of the stature of the USSR, as it has always been. Putin's been very, very vocal about that, and he's been very, very consistent. I mean, even before 2022, well before, talking about the fact that the USSR falling was the greatest catastrophe of modern times, of modern geopolitics. I think that argument has been more vocal and has been afforded much more time than Ukraine not being a real state or a real nation. I think we have to look at that. In terms of what you're saying about propaganda, I mean, I don't know what you're looking at, but having worked in propaganda, having been in Russia, I see much more about, rather than it being, like I said, this ever-expanding border, it's returning Russia to the reverent respect of what it was when it was the Soviet Union, and that's where Putin garners his support more from his hardcore support. Yeah, that's exactly it. If I'm going off on a tangent here, I do apologize. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning.
What I'll do is, Danny, what I'll do now is, I know Austin, you wanted to jump in earlier with Patrick, so I don't know if I'd rather not go back into the Yugoslavia. I think we can beat that to another. This is a Russia space. So if you can kind of hone in specifically on this comment that we're having about Russia, Ukraine. Go ahead, Austin.
Yeah, sure. Again, when it comes to proxy conflicts, there's a lack of agency on the proxy itself, and that's not being observed in Ukraine, which is why I think it's disingenuous to call this a proxy conflict. That being said, additionally, when we're talking about loss of life, everything like that, something I hear often from the side that's more sort of Russia friendly is the loss of life is condemnable, yada yada yada. When the reality of the situation, again, as I sort of prefaced earlier, is that we are seeing Ukrainians deciding to defend their own territory. If Russia wants to end the loss of life, they can withdraw from the invasion. I mean, this is since day one. This has been an option on the table for Russia. This is an option to any aggressor in a war of imperialistic conquest. And so I think it's very disingenuous to sort of make the argument of, we're pro the preservation of life, whilst not sort of condemning the invasion itself. And I think that's what results us back to talking about why sort of Western support for Ukraine is important, because often we hear this argument that because the West is supplying, or NATO in particular, supplying Ukraine with arms, that Ukraine is somehow losing agency, that they don't have the ability to make their own decisions. But via that same logic, wouldn't it be capable to say that Iran is conducting policy based upon their supply of Shahed drones? Would it be the same to talk about Chinese financial and logistical supplies to Russia? Does that sort of deprive Russia of legitimacy or agency? Is all of this an Iranian proxy war? I think it's ludicrous to sort of describe this as a proxy war.
Actually, and with that, I do. Well, you know what, Patrick, go ahead, and then I'm going to go to Doug. Go ahead, Patrick. You wanted to answer.
Yeah, both those arguments Austin made are like patently ridiculous. I think in history, this is the greatest ever example of a proxy war. Not just one country waging a proxy war against Russia, using Ukraine as a cudgel against Russia, but the entirety of NATO brought along for the ride as well. So I think this is probably beyond debate at this point, but you're welcome to to navel gaze on that one if it makes you happy.
Yeah, I think Patrick's argument lacks both water and standing. I think there are far better examples to talk about if you want better examples of a proxy war. And if you open a basic history book on the Cold War, you'll find plenty of examples there. One of which would not be the breakup of Yugoslavia, but I digress.
So, go ahead, Khaleesi.
No, I was just going to go towards Doc because I know he's just joined. Sorry, also, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to actually ask Doc, because I know you're generally a lot of the domestic political debates, etc. And I did want to get your opinion on. I think it was yesterday or today, where Trump in an interview said that if Putin does not, accept whatever ceasefire within 24 hours, that he would vastly increase arms shipment to Ukraine, basically saying that he is completely open to even increasing even more than what President Biden is doing right now in providing military support to Ukraine. And I think it's also important to highlight that the first time Ukraine received javelins was under the Trump administration. So I with any other comment, but I would like you to kind of hit that domestic political aspect as well on Trump kind of indicating increased military support possibly to Ukraine.
Yeah. So thanks. I would like to address a prior conversation, but on that point, I think for those who've seen the entire conversation and not just I'm not saying it was clipped out of context, but for the full context, what Trump was discussing was how he would end the war, what tools and techniques, what game theory he would use. And he's done this before. He would use the carrot and the stick, right? And that's a smart thing to do. He was basically using the stick with Russia, the stick saying, well, I'll just empower Ukraine with weapons and support if Russia doesn't immediately cease fire. The other cane and whip approach is pointed right at Zelensky, as Patrick has mentioned in here several times, that all we would need to do, in my opinion, and Patrick's, would be to announce that we were going to cease supplying the war. As far as this being a proxy war or not, look, Daniel, Austin, Michael, excuse me, but we don't want to talk about renaming vaccines to include mRNA. Okay, a proxy war is war by other means. It's the most simple, basic definition. And right now, the U.S. is absolutely engaged in a proxy war because without us, there would be no war. The fight would have been over a long time ago. Okay, so for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is, I think Patrick's right, that we're in charge of command and control. So we're actually making the decisions. Zelensky is a puppet, I would agree. But as to the popularity, and I think Michael mentioned this, he deferred to polls, quote unquote, polls, to point out that even though the war might not be popular with some officials, that it isn't it's popular with the American public. That is a joke. That's an absolute joke. The media number one.
Okay.
No,
so I need to just put this. No. You just called me a liar, and I've got the Pew Research poll right in front of me.
Interrupt me. Right?
You literally called me a liar.
Do not interrupt me. Thank you. Okay, you can have your response. You've been up here for an hour. I just got up. Thank you for not interrupting me. Okay, look, it is not popular with U.S. public. I'm a member of the U.S. public. I've been a member of the U.S. public for 64 years. I talk to thousands of people on Twitter, all from all over the world. I have a very good sense of what is happening here in America. Okay, I'm a fairly popular, I'm going to say this, a conservative influencer on Twitter right now. I get a lot of engagement. I spend a lot of time. I listen more than I talk, Michael. Okay, so look, here's the deal. It's unpopular because we do not want to fight another European war, and we're stepping up to it. What's happening right now, because it is a proxy war, it's actually been papered. What is that paper? It's a Lend-Lease agreement, right? That both Republicans and Democrats so far are supporting in the U.S. Congress. But that is being whittled away. There was a vote brought up by Matt Gaetz that more than 100 congressmen signed on to end the military supplies. So right now there's not the political muscle there, but every day that Trump gets more popular, every day that he assumes a preeminent and indefensible position in the race, that the Democrats who have to run again in 2024, and that campaign has started, that they're going to have to think about whether or not they want to support Biden, support the Democrats, support NATO, and continue funding this war. And I'm here to tell you, I don't think they will. I think that the support is starting to crater, and that's the first sign of it. The other sign, and I'll end with this, the other sign of this was an interview that Tucker Carlson had with Mike Pence, where Mike Pence repeatedly steered the conversation back to his active support and call for Biden to send more tanks and more planes to Ukraine. And he was booed off the table in that. And that is the sense, that is the proof that I know what I'm talking about when I talk about the American public support. This is an illegal war by a traitorous and illegal president. Why is it traitorous? Because there's been no declaration of war. There's no authorization of military force. The public has not been able to weigh in and offer their support. So you can take your polls, fold them 4 ways from Sunday, and sit on them respectfully.
Doc, so if I may, Congress has extensively, every single package of military support has been approved by Congress, bipartisanship by both sides, Republican and Democrat in Congress, every single one. But I know, Michael, you wanted to
That's what I just said happened. That's what I said happened. And I'm saying that the Matt Gaetz vote demonstrates that the support is weakening.
Matt, again, the support is weakening. It's weakened for Republicans from 53 to 47. You know, this is not that, and that's for support for Ukraine reclaiming territory, even in a prolonged conflict. Again, I understand you talk with people, and I understand that you think that you understand all of America.
And
because
I live here.
You spoke to a lot of conservatives. You live here. I understand. I spend time in the US. I work in the US. I've been to the US many times. Again, I don't trust anecdotal things. I trust actual evidence-based research. And Gallup and Pew are the two best research.
Files prove that. You're naive to think.
Okay, Doc, let Michael finish. Doc, let
Look,
Michael finish.
I let you.
Well, he interrupted me, so I felt just fair. I'll stop.
Look, polls are far more accurate than just your opinion or because you spoke with a few people who are of the same political lean. Yes, the amount of people who are less supportive of the war has grown. I'm not arguing that. That's what I'm saying. It's gone from 53 to 47. But that doesn't mean the American people are against this. And regardless of which, it's actually something that the Defense Department will get done, or it'll be funded through NATO, or it'll be funded through the EU, or it'll be funded through defense contracts. I don't understand what your point is. The point I wanted to make, I have to.
If you didn't understand my point, then you're really intellectual horsepower that's usually represented on this space.
Cool. Thank you for your very respectful words there. Again, I want to leave it on this, that right now we're debating on what border conflicts and what the world looks like going forward. Do we want a world where neighbors, if they're bigger, can just invade other neighbors and get away with it? Or do we want a world where effectively the borders are either solved by referendums, by peace deals, by actual diplomacy, rather than by force? Because again, the last time we had borders, being changed by force was the Second World War, or really the Korean War, if you want to get into it.
But you're the one advocating for more violence. I've been calling for
no,
peace.
I'm advocating
for a year.
Again,
In
but
Vietnam,
you're advocating for
they had peace talks for 8 years.
First of all,
Zelensky and the U.S. have
first of all, can you
refused to
stop
come to the
interrupting?
table. You are advocating for
Can you
more
stop
violence.
interrupting?
You are not advocating for peace.
No.
Do not
Can
come
you
in here,
stop
put
talking,
that cloak
please?
over your shoulders and pretend
Buddy.
you're a peacemaker. You're advocating for more death.
No, I'm advocating for war to not be an option on the table. Because even if Russia was to go to the peace table right now and Ukraine was to give them everything they wanted, so let's say all the territory Russia's occupying would become part of Russia right now. Russia will then come back in 4 years and take the rest, and it will send a giant message to Armenia, Azerbaijan, Morocco, Algeria, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, all these countries who will be under the impression that you can now change borders by force and war. And that is a lot more devastating and impactful going down the road, because it will keep happening. Right now, by the West sending just a tiny bit of their budget, we are showing people and showing other countries and showing the rest of the world that war should not be the way that borders change. And that's a pretty good way. I'm willing to spend a little bit of the US money and to actually fight what you smack Russia down on this one, and we break the back of the Russian military, which the US pretty much have at this point. And we don't have to deal with war being what actually changes our borders. Because again, when we did that, that was the Second World War. And it was absolutely devastating to the entire continent. And that's exactly what I want to try and avoid here. It's been great to chat to you guys.
Yeah, sorry, I had to cut you off because unfortunately, though, to everybody here, we are going to wrap up this space. Michael, I know you were going to sign out, but we are going to wrap up the space. Khaleesi, I'll push it on to you to see if you have any final comments that you wanted to share.
Thanks, all source. Yeah, no, I think it was a great debate. I would have liked to have continued it. I know that we don't have time this evening. I want to thank all the speakers. Michael, I know you got cut off, but that was a great point. It's going to leave everyone wanting more. The point that we got cut off on. See, Patrick's already giving a laughing emoji. So great space. Thanks, guys. Thanks, all source.
Yeah, and thank everybody here. I think we'll have more Russia-Ukraine spaces in the future. I think this was specifically tied to because of the Crimea Bridge bombing and the destruction there. But this is definitely going to be something that I think, I'll piggyback on what Oliver said and a lot of the other speakers said, is that this war is going to last a lot longer. And we're probably going to have a lot more Russia-Ukraine spaces. Unfortunately, we did have to wrap it up for today. So with that, we will end this. And I appreciate all the speakers for coming here. Thank you very much.